Hello, everybody. We're on to the next step of what's called the road to the revolution. These are the events that happened before the American Revolution officially began. And today we are going to talk about the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, which is one of the most famous stories in history and American history related to the revolution. So in the last slideshow we left off, we talked about the Boston Tea Party, and that was when the Sons of Liberty organized a group of people who went onto some ships that were parked in the Boston Harbor. They ran onto the ships, they grabbed chests of tea, and they threw the tea into the water, which is what you're looking at this picture. And they destroyed about $1 million worth of tea. And that event happened on December 16th in 1773. And as we said in the last slideshow, nobody was caught and nobody got in trouble. And the Sons of Liberty did not hurt anybody. They just destroyed the tea. But you can imagine that the King of England, King George III, was furious. So King George is so angry that they have destroyed all of this tea and that they're organizing protests. So he decides to send a huge fleet of British warships. And the ships are coming from England, and they're blocking the harbor in Boston. Those ships arrive in March of 1774. So in this picture, you can see this is a sketch. So these are big English ships. They're full of soldiers. Also, they have cannons and gunpowder and musket balls and muskets, and they are warships sent to mean business. This is a map of Boston at the time of the Revolution. Now, Boston, strangely, doesn't look like this quite anymore because of something that happened after the Revolution. But this part of Boston is called the Boston Head, and this part of Boston is called Boston Neck. And that's going to come up later in this story. So Boston Head is the very crowded part of Boston. It's where the people of Boston lived. It's where most of the businesses were. It's also where the dock was, and you can see this is the big dock that's jutted out into the water. Although it's not colored, this, where my mouse is flowing now, is all of the Boston Harbor. So this is all water all over here. And Boston was like a little head that stuck out into the middle of the water. And this is Charlestown. This is going to come into play later in this story as well. So just take a look at that map so you can kind of picture what Boston looked like. Boston Head, Boston Neck, and this is the Boston Harbor. So what King George did was he sent this fleet of armed ships, and he told them that they needed to block the harbor. So these ships here, you can see the British flag on them, completely surrounded the port of Boston. And they completely surrounded it so that no ships could go in and no ships could go out. And the direction from the king was those ships were going to stay there, parked in the harbor, until the people of Boston repaid the cost of the tea as well as the taxes that the king could have collected. So this is called the blockade, which means the blocking of Boston Harbor. And this started in March of 1774. This affected the people of Boston greatly because everything that they needed, not everything, but many things that they needed came in on ships. And many of the people who lived in Boston depended on shipping in order to make a living. So if they were fishermen, if they were traders, if they were shipbuilders, if they did anything that required a ship, they couldn't operate their businesses. So at this time, many people in Boston began to lose money. They lost their jobs. Many people were starting to go hungry. And this is the blockade of Boston Harbor because the British ships would not let anyone in or out of Boston. So that started in 1774. And then the Sons of Liberty and some of their friends, we call them the colonists, they begin to call themselves the Patriots. That's where our football team gets their name. They begin to call themselves the Minutemen, which I'll explain in a minute. But the colonists, the Patriots, and the Minutemen, they're all the same group. They begin to hide ammunition. This word stockpile means they hide it. This is a picture of a farm that's in Concord, Massachusetts. And this is where many of the Minutemen, the colonists, started to store gunpowder and extra bullets and extra rifles and things. And they were preparing in case the British attacked. So they had to hide these things, but they hid them in different places throughout New England. And this was one of the places. It's called the Colonel James Barrett House in Concord, Massachusetts. So this is some pictures of the type of things that would have been hidden at that farm. These are barrels, and in the barrels are gunpowder, which is what makes a musket fire. This is a musket, so this is like a rifle. This is the type of gun that people had in the time of the American Revolution. So soldiers had these, but they were mostly for like hunting to provide food for your family. This is called a powder horn, and it is literally a horn of an animal, and it's hollowed out. And in it, a colonial man would put some gunpowder from these big barrels, and he'd load it in here. And that's what he needed to make his musket work. So the colonists hid these kinds of supplies on that farm that I showed you. And they were hiding them there because they didn't want the British to get them, but they wanted a supply just in case they were attacked. So some spies, there were spies on the British side and there were spies on the colonial side. Some spies find out that the British know about the ammunition in Concord. And the spies find out that the British plan to go to Concord and they're going to take the ammunition. So they know that this stuff is hidden, the British do, and the British decide that they'll go to Concord and they will capture this ammunition. The only thing the spies weren't sure about at first is how will they go? How will the British get to Concord? So I'm going to show you some maps. So this is back to the map of Boston. And you can see that this part where my mouse is going now is all the water. So the British were like docked down here. There were those ships were parked all over here. And the British had two choices. They could put their men into smaller rowboats and row across the water here and then get on land over there. That was their possible if they went by water. Or they could take all of their soldiers and march through Boston and march down Boston Neck and then continue on a road to Concord by walking. And Concord was like over here. So the Patriots knew that, and the Patriots are the colonists, the Sons of Liberty. They knew that the British were heading to Concord. They just didn't know which way they were going to go. So they came up with this secret plan. And the secret plan, which was designed by the Sons of Liberty, was called one if by land and two if by sea. You probably have heard that at some point in your life. One if by land, two if by sea. This was their plan. This is a church that is in downtown, actually it's in the north end of Boston, and it's called Old North Church. And during the colonial times, it was the tallest church steeple in Boston. It's also up on a hill, kind of. So it could be seen for miles around. And up here, this part of the church steeple, this is called the belfry, there were two windows. And the Sons of Liberty made a plan. They said, if the British start to cross the water by boat, then we're going to hang two lanterns. But if they start to walk down Boston Neck and they're going to march all the way to Concord, then we'll hang one lantern. So one, if the British go by land down Boston Neck, and two lanterns if the British decide to get into boats and row across Boston Harbor. So the Sons of Liberty make this plan, and all of the people who are on the side of the Sons of Liberty know about this plan, and they're kind of waiting for the information. So one night, the night is April 18th, and it's 1775, the British, if you can follow this red arrow, decide that they're going to go to Concord, and they decide to row in their boats across Boston Harbor And then they'll get to this part here, and they will march along until they get to Concord, which is over here. So the spies find out that they're going to cross the water. So on April 18th, 1775, so Boston Harbor's been closed for about a year. At approximately 10 p.m., the spies run to the Old North Church, and they tell a man that's working there, climb up to the steeple, hang 2 lanterns. The British are crossing by water. So that man runs to the top of the steeple and he hangs 2 lanterns. So remember that Old North Church is super high. It's the tallest church spire in the city, so everybody can see it. Paul Revere is waiting at the bottom of a hill. He sees the 2 lanterns. He jumps into a rowboat with with 2 friends, and they row across a part of Boston Harbor. Now, what's amazing about this is these ships here, these are the British warships that are parked in the harbor. They have cannons, they have guns, they have thousands of soldiers. And they had to sneak their little rowboat kind of very close to those ships and cross the harbor in total silence. When they get to the other side, so here's Boston Harbor, and this church that they have here actually blocks the water, and they cross over the water. This is Paul Revere. And he starts to ride his horse, and he's headed toward Concord. And we'll come back to his slide in just a minute. So he's the yellow, okay? However, he wasn't the only person. There was also a person named William Dawes. He was a friend of Paul Revere's. He was a son of Liberty. And he got sent to do the same job, and he went this way on the roads. So he went down Boston Neck, and he went along this blue road. And the whole time, both of those men were riding their horses, and they were yelling something. So you may have heard the British are coming, or you may have heard the Redcoats are coming. Most historians think that it is more likely that Paul Revere said, sound the alarm, the regulars are coming. The regulars was the name of the soldiers that were, that's what they called their soldiers. So the regulars, the British, and the Redcoats are all the same thing. It is most likely that this is what Paul Revere said, but many people retell the story and they use those words. But either way, this picture shows what he did. He rode on this horse. He rode first across the Boston Harbor in a rowboat, and then there was a horse on the other side. He jumped on that horse, and he ran down on his horse. He galloped down the road, and he yelled this message to people. And as he rode by each house, you can see this man is inside. People were sleeping. This started at 10 in the evening, 10 o'clock p.m., and Paul Revere rode as fast as he could and yelled this message out. He woke people up. So people like this woke up. They jumped out of bed. They got on their clothes. They grabbed their rifle. They grabbed their bullets and their gunpowder. And they either went by foot or they jumped on a horse. And they all started to head to Concord. So these men, these were people who were supportive of the Sons of Liberty. They called themselves the Minutemen because they were ready to get into a battle within a minute's notice. So that's why they're called the Minutemen. So Paul Revere wakes up all these Minutemen, tells them to get out of your house, get to Concord, and he keeps riding down the road. At the same time, William Dawes is doing the same exact thing, but on the other side of Boston. At around midnight, so Paul Revere's been going for about 2 hours, a little longer than that. Around midnight, Paul Revere's going down the road, and he runs into a group of British soldiers. So these were soldiers who were out on patrol. They're sort of like the police of the time, and they see him. The British soldiers tell Paul Revere to stop, and they interrogate him. That means they ask him questions. So this is another picture. So in this painting, they show Paul Revere's on his horse, and this small group of British soldiers surround him, and they ask him questions. Where are you going? Who are you? Why are you yelling? And he basically tells them the whole story. He says, we're going to fight back. You're not going to take our ammunition. So these soldiers get a little bit scared because they don't know that these other British soldiers are leaving Boston and marching to Concord. These are just people who are along the road to between Boston and Concord. They don't know that somebody's coming. So they get a little nervous. So what they do is they steal Paul Revere's horse. They knock him off his horse. They take his horse and then they tell him to go. So Paul Revere continues on foot, like he runs through the forest and he runs down the road. They've taken his horse and he gets to this house that is in Lexington, Massachusetts. When he gets to the house in Lexington, Massachusetts, he warns two important people who are staying in that house. It's Samuel Adams, who we heard about from the Boston Tea Party, and somebody else named John Hancock, who's another leader of the American Revolution in Boston. And those two men are staying in the house. And Paul Revere gets to the house and he tells them, you have to get away. The British they're coming. They're going to capture you. So Paul Revere's ride ends like that. The British knock him off his horse, they take it, and he runs to this house and he tells his two friends, get out of town because the British are coming. But all of the other men that he had woken up, they continue heading to Concord. They go on horse, they go on foot, and they continue to wake up other people who are on their side so that an enormous group of people who are colonists, who call themselves patriots or Minutemen, are all heading to Concord, Massachusetts, and they're going to defend the ammunition and the supplies that they have stored at this farm in Concord. So I'm going to end the story there, but this is kind of the very last thing that happens before we actually get into a war. Sorry. And the last thing, that I want to show you is a close-up map of what was happening now that you know the story. So this black line here is Paul Revere rode across this part of Boston Harbor. He rode on this line where my cursor is going, and this is where he gets, he gets captured right there. William Dawes is this black line that goes on the bottom, and he actually meets up with Paul Revere, and they continue to here. And this red line shows the British cross the harbor in some boats, and then they begin their march to Concord. And here's Concord, a small town about 20 miles outside of Boston. So next time we'll pick up with what happened next.